Welcome and thank you for joining today's conference, African Swine Fever Update. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened up the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. To submit a written question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel. Enter your question in the message box provided. When you are ready to send your question, please hit Enter on your keyboard. Please note all connections are muted at this time. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. With that, I'll turn the call over to Liz Fernandez. Liz, please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Liz Fernandez with the Professional Development Staff, and I'd also like to welcome you to today's webinar. Our speaker today is Dr. Richard French. Dr. French is a veterinary pathologist serving animal health needs globally. He is lead Global Animal Health Partners, LLC. He recently served in China as the head of the Health Management Center for Boehringer Ingelheim. Previously, he was the Vice President of Animal Health Diagnostic Services China area for the CP Group. He was the former Dean of the School of Animal Studies and Allerton Chair of the Animal Health Science at Becker College. Dr. French acquired his DVM from the University of Illinois. He went into small animal practice for several years and then returned to academics, receiving a master's in parasitology and a PhD in neuropathology, and completed a residency in anatomic pathology. Dr. French then served as a tenured faculty at the University of Connecticut and as a director of the New Hampshire Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. Dr. French is a member of the USDA National Animal Health Emergency Response Corps and has served in national and international disease outbreaks. Dr. French's primary interests are in emerging, zoonotic, and transboundary diseases of animal and public health significance. He has numerous publications and broad fields, which includes the first report of West Nile virus in the Northern Hemisphere. And with that, I'll turn the webinar over to Dr. French.
Good morning, everybody. What I wanted to present to you is an update on African swine fever and some of the approaches that are being taken predominantly in Asia for the control of this disease. So one of the things to note, and I'll start here, is that African swine fever virus is typical of viral hemorrhagic fevers. It infects macrophages and endothelial cells. These are the targets for this virus, which is why this virus causes such havoc within the host. One of the challenges of this disease and the production of an efficient vaccine is that the virus has a very large genome, and basically it causes immunological disruption, immune evasion, and the sickness behavior that we have noted in previous presentations. So just as examples, there are a vast number of publications on African swine fever now because of the presence in Georgia in 2007, but it regulates apoptosis in infected macrophages. It actually mimics other genes that are in the host, such as CD2-like genes and the 8 dendritic receptor. And so by doing this, again, it causes immunologic disruption in its host. And it also interferes with host interferon response. And as we're aware, interferon is critical for most viral infection control. So just some examples in terms of the interferon status in white blood cells during infection of African swine fever. During the last days of infection, up to 50% of the total white blood cells are destroyed within the host, and the remaining cells are really dysfunctional small-sized lymphocytes, reactive lymphocytes, and lymphoblasts. So you get really severe immune disruption in these animals. And again, this is why it's a challenge to produce a vaccine, because we look to do gene deletions, but if we're not deleting the genes that regulate immune response, then you still have a poorly efficacious vaccine. And we'll talk about this more later. So, but ultimately, you get complete depletion of lymphocytes and neutrophils and other white blood cells, and this is a big problem with this disease. If we think about this virus infecting macrophages, we have to go back to our veterinary school days to remember all the macrophages of the body. So monocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cells, but there are macrophage populations in fat tissue, the liver, our Kupffer cells, alveolar macrophages, subendothelial macrophages. It's a long list. What's important to know is all these cells are infected with the virus and impact immune function either locally or systemically within the host. Just an example, don't have time here in this presentation, but here's a good publication on the pathology and the hemodynamics with African swine fever. Ultimately, what you see is a lymphopenia, a neutropenia, a thrombocytopenia, possibly relating to the hemorrhagic condition, plasmacytosis, increased blast forms in circulation, increased abnormal cells in circulation, and increased dead cells actually in circulation if you were to do a blood smear on these animals. And you see all kinds of atypical cells, atypical lymphocytes, reactive vacuolated lymphocytes and lymphoblasts, hypersegmented neutrophils, and rosetting of red blood cells around affected macrophages or infected macrophages. Actually, these rosetting that you see around macrophages can be a diagnostic tool if you're to do a blood smear on an animal. A lot of information here. This is out of the group in Pirbright, Dr. Dixon, basically highlighting all the impacts of different proteins produced by African swine fever that mimic CD2 protein, and things of that sort. But ultimately, the bottom line message here is there's a prediction that half to two-thirds of approximately 150 genes encoded by ASF are not essential for viral replication. But these are important in the virus's survival and transmission in its host. And these are those genes that impact the host immune response. This, again, is the challenge for vaccine production for this virus. So ultimately, African swine fever is a master manipulator of the immune system. And as a master manipulator of the immune system, you get significant immune dysfunction, but then remember that this virus also infects endothelial cells, and this results in a follow-up destruction of hemostatic mechanisms for hemostasis, leading to the hemorrhagic condition that we all have learned to know of African swine fever, a hemorrhagic fever. And these are some of the classic things you would see. These are pictures from the Plum Island. So early on, the animal's up and ambulatory, but you see a frank hemorrhage, or you can see melena, depending on where the hemorrhage is occurring in the GI tract. And then if you open these animals up, you can see hemorrhage almost anywhere within the animal. This is subperitoneal hemorrhage around the kidney of the pig, but quite extensive subperitoneal hemorrhage in that animal. And the hallmarks that we typically think of are splenomegaly. So you have a febrile pig, maybe some evidence of cutaneous hemorrhage or hematuria or melena, and you open these pigs up and you have the hallmark sign of splenomegaly and enlarged hemorrhagic lymph nodes. This is the gastrohepatic lymph node here, the ideal lymph node to collect for any diagnostics. So moving into Asia quickly, that was our quick review of African swine fever. So now we're moving into Asia. And this is just, this is a slide that was presented at the Lehman Conference, China, in November of 2019 by Mara representative. Mara is the Ministry of Agricultural and Rural Affairs in China, similar to our Department of Agriculture. And basically what they talk about are the disease burdens within China. So when they talk about, they classify them. So first class animal diseases, they have 17 kinds, second class, 77, third-class animal diseases, 63. But the most important part here is the prevalence of the must-report OIE diseases. So these are the list, what we typically think of the list A diseases for OIE. China has 100% of those reportable diseases of swine, 100% of those reportable diseases of poultry, 91% of those of sheep, and since they just had an outbreak of lumpy skin disease, they now have 100% of reportable OIE diseases for cattle. The question you need to ask yourself here is how often do you see reportable diseases either through the OIE or through ProMed or FAO or other reporting sites within China? The challenge is we don't get accurate reporting of all diseases. And this isn't true just of China. This is true of most of Asia. And then issues of complacency. So if you've reported African swine fever 150 times, you might not report it again, that type of thing. This is one of the challenges in understanding what's occurring around the world. So one of the things we have to think about is the farm production system in the countries that we're talking about. And again, I'm talking predominantly about Asia. So traditional Asian production is small production. 60% or more of farms have 200 or less sows on those farms. They don't control their feed. They don't control their food business, anything of that sort. And they're relying on other trucking industries to move pigs around from sow farms to finisher farms and things of that sort. There's also fully integrated farms in China. So they control the feed business, the farm business, the food business, and the retail components. But there's one large weak link in all of this, and that's veterinary diagnostic services. And this, again, when I talk about these things, I'll mention China, but you need to think about this in Asia as a whole. And Asia would include India, Russia, China, and then all the other Asian countries, Southeast Asia, that you might be thinking of. So here's an example of this weakness or this weak link in diagnostics. So if you look at China in terms of swine production, it far outweighs all the rest of the world. When you look at the regional diagnostic market, it's extremely volatile, it's underdeveloped, there's a huge need for education, and again, remember that these countries, and not just China, are plagued with 90% of OIE-listed diseases, and 100% of those of swine, poultry, and cattle. So if you look at the regional diagnostics, you look at North America, we consume or basically produce 56% of the diagnostic market. And then you have the EU at about 30%, and then you have a distant Asia coming in 11%, and China only represents 3% of the global market, about 700 million RMB, which would be about 100 million US dollars. So this is where there is marked disparity between production and the infrastructure they have to monitor, survey, and control disease. This is part of the problem, and this is what creates a risk for North America and other markets. The other thing we have to think about are just examples of ongoing challenges. So we have African swine fever in Asia with the outbreak starting in 2018, and now it is in all Asian countries, including India. They now have African horse sickness in Thailand. Their first report was in June of 2020, and they still have ongoing cases of African horse sickness. Got to remember that this is a vector-borne disease, and culicoides is present in Thailand year-round, so this is going to be a big challenge for them. And then lastly, lumpy skin disease showed up its face in China. It's been a problem in Eurasia, and it's been moving easterly, and it is now present in China, and there's been a number of reported outbreaks in China, and it is not presently under control. So getting back to African swine fever, I'm going to talk a little bit about China and pork production, ASF in China, and then ASF vaccines in China. But what I'm talking about, again, in China relates to other Asian countries. I just don't have the details in this presentation. So China's directive, and this is coming from MARA, Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, is the concept of a full-out campaign on recovery and the development of infrastructure for sustainability. Keeping in mind 2019 was the year of the pig, so it got a lot of press, and China has a long cultural history with pigs. This is a very old document here, which is actually explaining that more pigs, more manure, more food. This has kind of been the culture of China when you look at the rural swine production within China. The other thing you have to keep about is they don't just have African swine fever. So pre-ASF, the price of swine diseases in China, calculating for the swine industry, this is sourced out of IDEX Livestock and Poultry Diagnostics in China, they lose about 53 billion yuan to PRRS, 21 billion to CSF, 21 billion to pseudorabies, APP at 15, and mycoplasma at 15 billion yuan. This is on an annual basis. So 126 billion yuan annually in losses due to disease pre-ASF. If we put this in US dollar figures, that's 8.2 billion US dollars due to loss from disease pre-ASF. One of the other things you have to understand about China and the Asian markets is they prefer wet markets. They are the norm in Asia. You can find them in all Asian countries. Chinese prefer what is called hot pork. So when a pig is slaughtered, it's never frozen. In fact, it oftentimes is not refrigerated. It's taken out and sold on the street first thing in the morning in what are called wet markets or fresh food markets. The other thing you have to keep in mind is where the food comes from for pigs. The majority of the pigs, again, 60% of swine production in China pre-ASF was small farms. So in a city like Beijing of about 30 million people, we have what are called the ring roads. So the rings of roads around the city as it grows and grows and grows. 57% of pig production is in small farms at the outer rings of the tier 1 cities in China. So Hangzhou, Wuhan, Beijing, Shanghai, they all operate on this concept. So you have the outer ring road, and then all the farms are on that outer ring road. And where do they get their food or their feed for the pigs? The garbage from the city. Beijing produces approximately 18 million metric tons of garbage per day, and this was historically used for swine feed for small production farming, and then that pork comes back into the city. Again, MARA has made this illegal, but it's still an ongoing practice for small farms because they can't afford commercial feeds. And this is also part of the reason that this disease spread so swiftly and across China, but also across Asia, because all Asian countries have these practices of garbage or slow feeding. Then you have pork movement. So again, trucks are the biggest culprit, but people come in a quick second to that. Pigs are certainly able to carry the pigs if pigs are being transported, but it's typically the trucks that contaminate one farm after another farm. Their feed sources are now contaminated, but we don't know the extent to which they're contaminated. There's been some studies, but they have not been published. Their food is also contaminated because when they got hit hard with African swine fever and farms were dying, instead of depopulating the farms, they took live pigs, sent them to market, and because they didn't want to overwhelm the market with fresh pork, they put that pork into pork reserves. So their pork reserves are known to be contaminated with African swine fever, and this is food for people. And again, pork is the mainstay. Any airport, any train station you can go to in China, you will find the local pork products as well as other food products for transport. And it's transported typically in bags, boxes, or suitcases. So here again, we're coming back to China, swine production relative to the rest of the world. 75% of the global swine production is now under direct impact of ASF. So if we look at all the countries that are impacted by African swine fever, it's quite remarkable, and it's not just Asia, as you're aware of. You have countries in Eastern Europe and Eastern Bloc countries that are also still impacted by ASF. So if we look at this in terms of number of pigs worldwide, this is 2018 data. So 1 million heads. So again, you look at China swine production and then post-ASF. So to date, they are down 75 to 80% of swine production. And you can see the impact of this on a global scale. If we look at the number of pigs worldwide, they've been relatively steady. They've been slowly declining over time. But if you look at the impact of just China on this, you see a significant impact on the number of pigs worldwide. And of course, this has opened a market for swine or import of pork products into China because they want to feed their population, and pork, again, is a mainstay. But it impacts food security. People will certainly try to take shortcuts, try to make money. It pressures to meat production or protein production, and it puts pressures on global trade. So just as an example, in terms of how do we maintain protein production or meat production or working farms, there's been a transition in farming practices in Asia. So this is a swine production facility in China where they have transitioned to ducks. You can see the different age ducks within this farm. These are pig producers that are now producing ducks. So you can surmise what problems they might see in these populations in new disease challenges that we could see in the short future. China is also trying to build out of this problem. They're mimicking this after Russia, and I'll cover Russia in just a bit. But basically, China is building the biggest pig farms that you will see in the world to keep up with the demand of pork, but also try and maintain biosecurity. This is an example of a farm that is in production, that is in development. 13 floors, 30,000 sows, just short of 1 million finisher pigs per year. And due to ASF, companies, producers can get non-interest government secured loans to rebuild and build these intense, fully integrated farm facilities. And here's just another example in more southern climates in Southeast Asia, where they've moved into not only ducks, but also ostrich, and they're also producing beef cattle and using these for dairy cattle as well. So swine farms moving into other species, which again will put challenges on our disease disease monitoring and surveillance and the risks that we have to our markets within the U.S., not only in swine, but in poultry, in duck, and in cattle. There's a number of references. Everybody has their plan for dealing with African swine fever. I list them here. It's not worth talking about this slide, but you have it in your PowerPoint presentation, so you can link to these. But almost every country has their regional strategy. This is the regional strategy for control of African swine fever in Africa. The European Commission has a strategy for control, and they have very detailed documents, just as we do with the USDA. And our friends to the north, Canada, has a response plan for African swine fever. You know, where are the risks? So one of those things is to increase the population of service dogs in airports and also in shipping ports. And then, of course, we have our own disease response strategy for African swine fever, which I'm sure all of you are aware of and all of you have reviewed thoroughly, and is probably changing on still a daily basis. You can find all of these documents and all of these resources through GARA, the Global African Swine Fever Alliance, I will provide the link to this, but all of this information is centrally located within GARA, which would include all the regional plans, the U.S. plan, Canadian plan, European, and then all the ongoing research, vaccine research, and training programs. So if you're looking for training programs other than what Liz Fernandez and USDA provides, there's a wealth of information in training programs within GARA. And again, GARA is a network of research collaborations. It does include Plum Island and Ames, but it connects basically the entire world. And it does include Qingdao, China. So you can get a wealth of information out of this resource. I would recommend it highly. So just a quick look at Europe. Europe's strategy has been to basically close borders. Every country has border control, either that's with a fence or by other means. The fences are predominantly to control wild boar because Europe really loves their wild boar populations. It's large hunting enthusiasts enjoy it just as we enjoy our white-tailed deer, maybe not in some states, but they're trying to control the movement of wild boar. But really you have to remember that a lot of the movement of this disease is trucks and people. So you can have the greatest fence to control wild boar, but if people, product, and trucks are still moving, the fence can do very little. And this is proven to be the case in Europe and Eastern Bloc countries as the disease has moved even with some of the most stringent border policies. Other strategies that they've used is to actually eliminate the wild boar. And in Lithuania, this was a strategy a few years back, 2014, where they were looking to leave only 10% of the current 60,000 strong wild boar population through basically a campaign to depopulate wild boar to try and control this disease. And you can imagine how ineffective or a strategy like that can potentially be. Going back to Russia, and then as I mentioned in China, this is their strategy is to try and build out of this disease. So what Russia has done is they basically made it illegal to have small farm production for pork. They're probably going to do the same thing for poultry. And they've moved into, and aggressively moved into, producing large, fully integrated farms. So this would be similar to that China farm. Instead of 13 stories, you have 13 or 14 farrow-to-finish facilities, and then large, separate sow facilities. And they have built a large number of these just in the last 2 years to replace all the small farm production or farms that are poorly designed for good biosecurity. And this has been a mandate of the Russian government, and now it's a mandate of the China government to build out of this disease. FAO has been critical for a lot of regional strategies for ASF control. Basically, their push is to have cooperation and transparency. The biggest problem is this right here. The bottom line is cooperation and transparency. We still do not have it within the Asian countries. And so this is one of the challenges. And I'll give you an example of a workshop that was done with all of the countries listed here. This was in Thailand. Basically, it's an FAO emergency session in Thailand in December of 2018, early in the outbreak, trying to get an assessment of where all countries stood. So this was before the disease had spread out of China to all these other countries: Mongolia, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, Thailand, Republic of Korea, Japan, and the Philippines were in attendance. And they looked at risk, and basically you have high risks, medium risks, or low risks, and you can see lots of high risks here based on live pig population, pork product movement, and wild boar population, and personnel availability and tick populations. Then they went into assessing early detection. Do you have the capability for early detection? You look at a country like Cambodia. I'm not picking on anyone here, but Cambodia was not ready at all for African swine fever, and within 4 months after this workshop, within 6 months after this workshop, the disease was in Cambodia. Some countries, China listed here, felt they were in very good shape for early detection for this disease. And then you have preparedness and prevention. So again, you see lots of red, unprepared, unable to provide preventive measures. This is typical of most of Southeast Asia. China felt they were in good shape. Japan felt they were in good shape. But again, you have to realize that China is endemic now for African swine fever. Japan is still has African swine fever under control. This is disparity in information, or the authenticity of information. And just another, the ability to respond, and then a recovery plan. Who has one? China was all set, Japan was all set, but the rest of Southeast Asia, other than Korea, this is South Korea, Republic of Korea, were well prepared. And actually, South Korea was well prepared for African swine fever and has kept the disease in check. And then they had a few corporate members there to see if corporations were available and ready to deal with African swine fever. But ultimately, most corporations did not have the infrastructure to deal with African swine fever at all. So getting back to our ability to respond, so this is within the U.S. And this is, again, if you haven't reviewed this, the disease response strategy for African swine fever. It's quite detailed, and it has everything right down to the diagnostic tests performed for African swine fever, what to collect, when to collect, what tests will be done, where to send it, which I'm sure you're aware of, but you should review on a regular basis because these things can change. And there's a detailed roadmap for exactly what will happen if there's a suspect African swine fever case in the United States, the what, when, where, and how. And this is all available within this USDA document. So it breaks it down to exactly what will be done, how long it will take to perform an ELISA test, a virus isolation, a PCR, and where those samples are going and what to do at each and every step. So this is, again, very, very important to review and maybe even have some of these critical documents available to you, immediately available to you. ultimately, the other thing we have to be aware of, and you have to start thinking about these things now when you're visiting farms or you're working with commercial producers or small producers, is the ability for trace back and the ability for trace forward. We need to have these things in place sooner than later, because once we have a suspect case, these things are going to be critical to control disease. And then, of course, we're all aware that if there's a suspect case, there's going to be a movement standstill. This can vary potentially with state, but likely USDA will overrule, and there could be a mandatory national stop of all swine live animal movement. And I believe the last I heard is that could be up to 72 hours, and so you have to be prepared for that. One of the other challenges, of course, is where are all the pigs? And there's been a lot of effort to understand where all the pigs are, down to less than one pig in a community. So where are the pigs? Where are the pig densities? Where are the feral pigs? Where are the potential ticks that can transmit the disease and create an endemic situation in feral pigs and ticks? And then where are the labs and who can test for African swine fever? African swine fever here is in the green, and you can see most states now and regional areas have the capability of testing for African swine fever. And they're doing it on a routine basis now, either through slaughter or through mortalities or cull pigs from different farms and facilities. And then where are the risks? I think you're all aware the World Pork Expo was canceled, and a number of other events were canceled, or pigs at fairs and things of that were canceled due to ASF. But you have to look at really how things move around the world. We get back to globalization. So keeping in mind that what's occurring in your state, in your community, in your town, there's product moving from around the world. And this is that ongoing process characterized by the integration of markets, nations, and technology to create an interdependent world economy. So one of the facts that comes out of this is the majority of vitamins used in production and companion animal feeds are from Asia. Nearly 100% of the vitamins we use in our cattle, in our pork, and our poultry are from Asia. So this is globality at its best. Things are fully interdependent in terms of feed production for the animals we produce in the U.S. And then we just think about the movement of people and other products. So this is just an illustration of all the airline flights in and out of the United States, and you can see the hot beds here within the U.S. These would all be critical locations for the introduction of a disease, either carried by a person or what that person's carrying, or the cargo that's on these airlines. These are the shipping lanes. So instead of airlines, we're talking about shipping. And of course, you would expect the West Coast is lit up, the East Coast is lit up, and the Great Lakes are lit up. And this product comes from all around the world. Everything that's coming in on the West Coast, of course, is coming out of Asia. And this includes the vitamins and other products that we use to maintain our feed production. These are all risks. Internal trucking, airlines, the people, the cargo that they carry, shipping, of course, and then it all starts in a small village, something loaded up on a truck. This truck shares a truck stop with something that's on a shipping container. You can paint the scenario any way you want. So here are just some examples, and these are good papers to review for the disease control strategies. This is control of African swine fever epidemics in industrialized swine populations. It's actually a good document. Ultimately, they determined that early detection of African swine fever is key for quick control of spread. Surveillance of dead animals resulted in the fastest detection of infected herds. And so on any farm, if you have cull animals or there's any mortality, those animals should be targeted to be tested for ASF, CSF, or any other transboundary animal disease. Surveillance of dead animals is critical. Do not just compost or dispose of those animals. Necropsy and test. This is what came out of this paper. Relevant measures to prevent the spread of African swine fever in European Union and in the pig sector. This is actually a review that they did of all the literature to look at all the different control strategies. So they reviewed everything from PubMed to other browsers and went through with an algorithm to pull out anything about disease control for African swine fever, and then they looked at whether it worked or didn't work. And so it's a long list. There's I think there is maybe 150 different disease control strategies, their resource, the reference, and then they broke it down into basically whether it was important for commercial farms. So again, whether it was applicable. So a number of them are applicable, some weren't. And then whether it was preventive measures were good for non-commercial, for small producers, and what might be applicable. If you want to have a comprehensive review of disease control strategies for African swine fever, this is a good source to start with, and then identify what would work for your producers in your area, your state, or your region. This is another review of factors influencing the risk of a breakdown in biosecurity programs due to the location of a pig farm. It's an older publication, but it still holds true. Back in 2003, things that you might think are common sense, but our small producers and even some of our commercial producers don't think about. That is adding new pigs without a quarantine period, not having a long enough quarantine. Failing to require testing of specific diseases. And allowing pigs to return from fairs, shows, and things. So these are all common sense things, but we still see it practiced within the industry. And the other thing that I've mentioned is, again, we have to keep in mind that the feed ingredients that we use for our animal production come from around the world. They are not sourced all within North America. And so we have to be aware of what survives in feed ingredients. A very nice study done by Scott D. A number of you are probably aware of this, out of Kansas, 2018. Basically, they looked at the survivability of a number of viruses within a number of different feed products. And ultimately, if you look at African swine fever, it survives quite well in soybean, organic meal, and a number of other products that we normally see in feed production. And they use Seneca Valley virus to mimic foot and mouth disease. You can also see foot and mouth disease survives quite well. And they actually found that it would survive in these feed products shipped overseas. So it has a long life within these shipped products. So all of these diseases can be transmitted through feed or feed products. PED would probably be our best example of a disease that likely came into the U.S. through contaminated feed bags, not the feed itself, but the containers that the feed was in. And the other thing to keep in mind is educating everyone that's involved in production. So all of you are well educated in pathogens that cause diseases, but our farm managers educated? Are the dispatchers and the sales personnel that are on and off these farms, are the drivers of the trucks, are they informed? You need to know that all of these people are educated, and this could be one thing that you can do as professionals is make sure this information, for example, that you're getting today, trickles down to everybody that's integral in terms of our food animal production. So biosecurity of pigs and farm, personnel education, training, and management commitments, and success equals cleaning thoroughly, disinfect, dry, and keep it clean. Some things you have to keep as simple as possible. 5 things to remember to really control African swine fever are these. Biosecurity. Second would be biosecurity. You might guess the third, it's biosecurity. You can't have enough biosecurity for this disease or actually any other. One of the things they learned in China is when they improved their biosecurity for African swine fever, they saw a significant decline in PRRS and pseudorabies and CSF outbreaks on their pig farms. And you can imagine that this was due to enhanced biosecurity. The fourth, though, would be early detection, early warning, and rapid response. You got to be ready to detect as soon as possible those cold animals, those unexpected mortalities on the farm. They should all be tested, and you should have a response plan in place for any positive. And then, of course, quarantine and depopulation. But early detection, rapid response is critical. So just some examples of what's taking place in China and in Asia right now. This is an example of a control measure for African swine fever. It's called the Accurate Tooth Pull Program or Tooth Extraction Program. The concept is if you have a bad tooth, you pull the tooth to save the teeth around it. African swine fever, when it shows up on a farm, moves slowly. And if you can detect the disease early enough on a farm, you have the potential to control the disease on the farm. This is the concept of the tooth extraction program. And it is being practiced in Asia at present. Ultimately, you have an inspection and monitoring program. So you're doing PCR. One of the pitfalls that they had with this is they were using oral fluids as their PCR testing or screening method, but oral fluids will detect the disease too late. You need to be detecting animals as soon as they're off feed. Any animal off feed would be tested. You kill the abnormal pigs, and then you deal with the room that that animal is in. So you try and basically do a regional quarantine and containment on a farm in terms of your personnel, your movement of feed, and everything else that's on that farm. And then you maintain an inspection and monitoring. And you can actually maintain a farm for a number of months that has been positive for African swine fever through this method. Their goal is to get as many pigs to market as possible at the right market weight. So they will use this, for example, on a finisher farm to try and control disease until they can get the pigs to market. They do not depopulate the pigs. Another method that is being used, this is usually by the large integrated producers, is compartmentalization as a means of ASF control. Compartmentalization we typically think of on a regional basis. This concept is not accepted by the World Trade Organization relative to trading partners. So in other words, if China has ASF, all of China has ASF. But you can compartmentalize some countries by saying the northern China does not have ASF, so they can export things of that sort. But it's not recognized by the World Trade Organization. It's not recognized as a means of disease control, but it is being used and is actually being promoted by the FAO, United Nations, and the OIE and other trading nations as a means of control of ASF. Ultimately, what this means is that if you have a farm, so you have a sow farm, and that farm will send out finishers to multiple finisher farms, you treat that farm in compartments, okay? So you have behind a gate, within a wall is a compartment. And actually each barn or each facility on this can be treated as a compartment. And then you have everything outside that compartment, the feed mill, bore stud, trucks, slaughter. And you control disease based on movement between compartments. So the people, the vehicles, the animals, the equipment and supplies, the facilities, carcass disposal, entry procedures, farm location, and even fly control. These are all considered to be critical control points in compartmentalization. We do know that flies can carry African swine fever. They're a mechanical vector. So if you have a number of farms, such as in the Carolinas, in close proximity, and you have a disease breakout on one farm, flies can transmit that disease from one farm to another farm, okay? And then, of course, we know about trucks. The other thing that they are working with, and this is actually introduced through the U.S. and through FAO, is HACCP programs. So hazard analysis and critical control points. The main factor here is these critical control points in terms of controlling disease. It's a roadmap to how to improve biosecurity and where to test, what to test, when to test. So if we go back to this farm and we're looking at a compartmentalization, you want to identify, pigs that are removed after weaning. Those pigs should be tested. Pigs that are cold should be tested. Certainly, new gilts coming into the farm should be tested. And any movement of a pig from one building to another building ideally should be tested in a compartmentalization control measure. This is being practiced by the large commercial farmers within Asia. And they'll do the same thing with the feed mill, keeping in mind feed mills can be a source of disease. So they look at all the critical control points for testing and diagnostics. So instead of testing both feed, they test in specific areas such as feed mixing, vitamin products coming in, and things that potentially can be contaminated before they make their bulk feed. And then, of course, truck washes. You certainly want to test feed trucks coming out of the feed mill, trucks moving between farms, so from a sow farm to a wean to finish farm, transfer farms, so cold facilities, and then certainly coming out of slaughter plants and coming back into production. So these are all critical control points for testing. And this has worked quite effectively for some of the large integrated producers within Asia in controlling African swine fever. The other thing that is critical is to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. This gets right down to the farm managers and the employees on the farm. One of the rules that was instituted by the company that I used to work for, this is taken from one of their PowerPoint presentations, this is CP Group, is a policy that you will be fired on the spot if biosecurity policies are not followed. So the employees got the message quite clear after just a couple employees were dismissed because of inappropriate behavior, biosecurity behavior. And this is just an example of a facility. This is in Thailand. So they have instituted HACCP programs on the farm. This is an entrance to one of their production facilities. And it's displayed right on this billboard here that they have a HACCP farm. They follow HACCP programs on the farm. They're designed for the farm, and they work quite effectively. So you start to think about testing places that you wouldn't normally test. You always think about testing the animal, testing the space right around the animal, but ventilation, drainage, the brushes they use to clean their boots in tight-to-get places, trucks and vehicles, the instruments they use to clean, and those places that are hard to get to. And even outside the farm. So in the residence, most farms in Asia, the workers on the farm live in residence on the farm, but outside the gate. So you want to test those facilities as well, right down to the phone and the computers that they're using and the refrigerator for their food. So they break it down into what are called zones, high-risk zones down to lower-risk zones, such as locker rooms, cafeterias, halls, warehouse, and loading docks. And it's been shown to be effective. So this actually works quite well in Asia for the large, fully integrated producers that can control all of these components. Moving into vaccines as a control strategy, there are vaccines that are being used in Asia. This is a killed vaccine, ASF vaccine that was used in Vietnam. I do not know if it's continued to be used in Vietnam. China has stated that they will have a vaccine by the end of 2019, early 2020. They do not have a licensed vaccine to date, but they did already make this announcement because they're trying to get ahead of this, and they were quite confident in their capability, but the news is conflicting. So you'll see reports in early 2019 where they've developed what appears to be a good working vaccine. They're making progress in the swine fever vaccine, but then these vaccines are actually put in the field. Unfortunately, one of the things that has been done in China and other Asian countries is they have a vaccine that they know is efficacious in the lab, but they do their trials in the field with producers. And then you get rejections to claims of African swine fever vaccine fix because they find out that ultimately these vaccines do not work. So, but there have been a number of vaccine field trials. One was begun in July 14th of 2019 in China with leading producers. There are 1.5 million doses of a live attenuated or not attenuated gene deletion vaccine put into the field. It was produced by a state-owned company, and it is still being used by some producers to date, as far as I know. And basically, the regimen was to vaccinate a farm with a recombinant 3 ASF protein deletion vaccine, vaccinate 2 times, 14 days apart, and then see if you have any problems after 10 days. Ultimately, it didn't work. Reported with the use of modified live vaccines was postmortem lesions which mimic what we described as chronic infections of African swine fever, abortions, focal skin lesions, fibrinous pericarditis, generalized lymphadenopathy and swollen joints, and consolidated lung loads. Wayne Johnson, some of you may know him. He's a pathologist out of Iowa, I believe, but he has been in China for about 15 to 20 years now. He has a diagnostic laboratory in Beijing. This is what he just reported in an update on African swine fever in China as of July 2020. Basically, there are several different candidate vaccines that have been developed and have had extensive field use in China. Some unapproved live and killed vaccines have been used in China and in Southeast Asia. There was a double deletion vaccine used extensively in China, but it has caused typical signs of systemic disease, including widespread abortions, infertility, mummification, stillborn weak piglets, increased pre-wean mortality, and chronic atypical African swine fever in finisher pigs. There's another unapproved gene deletion vaccine was introduced. Unfortunately, one of the problems with this vaccine is you can't detect it via ELISA. So you can't test pigs that have potentially been vaccinated with ELISA to see if they were vaccinated pigs, which makes it a problem if we're trying to monitor these pigs. Keep in mind, this is a modified live vaccine. It infects the pigs, it is causing disease, and it's transmissible between pigs. So what you have to be thinking about is we do not have only high virulent African swine fever in the marketplace now, in production facilities now. We have modified live vaccine viruses that are circulating in production, and they can create a potential problem because of our ability to detect these viruses that still cause disease. They also tried a 7-gene deletion candidate vaccine, which was seemed to prevent the most severe clinical signs of disease, but was unable to prevent persistent infections with African swine fever virus. So in other words, if these animals were inoculated with a 7-gene deletion vaccine and they were in contact with the virulent African swine fever, those pigs could develop persistent infections with African swine fever virus, the virulent form, and also carry this so-called non-lethal modified live vaccine. And there's discussion right now whether this will be allowed to be continued to use in China and Asia. The problem is there are producers, vaccine producers that get a hold of these modified live vaccines and replicate them and then sell these modified live vaccines on the black market. There's also been attempts to produce ASF-tolerant pigs. A number of producers that have had pigs that survive an outbreak identify these as super pigs, and they try to put these pigs back into breeding. Again, they're not the best genetic stock for a production facility, but they try and put these pigs back into breeding. The problem is that these pigs are likely to become chronic carriers of ASF, and it's going to be an ongoing problem. Lastly, the USDA has had some good candidates for vaccine production. They've been testing a vaccine in Vietnam. I believe they've concluded that testing, and ultimately, despite recent reports of a highly effective vaccine in the laboratory, African swine fever virus vaccine has been developed, but it's said to be commercially compatible vaccines is probably still years away. And when I say years, we're talking 3 to 5 years away. This was what was just recently reported by Douglas Cloud out of USDA Plum Island, who had probably the most promising data for production of a modified live vaccine for ASF control. Getting back to good resources, again, Gara, if you want a resource for almost everything, control strategies in every country, training programs around the globe, this is probably the best resource for all of those, and it's actually, you can link to it through the USDA's website. And within, there's another very good document, the Global Control of African Swine Fever. This is 2020 to 2025, so this is looking forward. There's a very good resource for this, but ultimately they identify that the biggest problems are inadequate biosecurity measures and human behavior. But I won't go into details because I think we're getting down to time here. Basically, this is out of this document here, Global Control of African Swine Fever. It's an FAO OIE document. It's a short document. It's only about 20 pages, so it's not a long read, but it has a lot of important information. This is what they're trying to instill in governments and nations around the world, the importance of understanding the strengths and weaknesses of their infrastructure, improved capability to conduct risk assessment, moving forward more quickly. Disease information submitted is transparent, timely, and accurate, up-to-date, and readily accessible. This is one of the greatest weaknesses that we have around the globe. and then networks for strengthening communication. I would say that the communication right now between the U.S. and China is probably the worst it's been in 3 decades, and this can impact our risk for disease within the U.S. So just one more, international standards for a safe trade of well understood, accepted, and promoted. This, for example, would be important for things like feed resources, soybean, corn, vitamins, minerals, all are sourced around the globe. So this is the picture as of January 1st. So we still have ongoing outbreaks behind all the green here. In Europe and Eastern Bloc countries, there are still ongoing outbreaks of African swine fever since January of 2020, outbreaks in Africa, and we continue to have reported outbreaks within Asia. The challenge with Asia, as you can see, Russia has nothing to report, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, India, but you have to assume that these problems are ongoing just because of the nature of the disease. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Rich. That was great. We do have a couple questions in the chat. The first question is, they're wondering why China is not vaccinating for PRV or PRRS. Finances, lack of vaccine availability?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, they do. So they do have, it's actually mandatory, and this is for large production. It's mandatory that you vaccinate pigs for FMD, CSF, pseudorabies, but not PRRS. PRRS, they only will vaccinate if they have a highly pathogenic PRRS. And then there's questions on the efficacy of whether PRRS vaccines work or whether you can control the disease through management strategies. But they do vaccinate for these diseases. The challenge that you have, again, is 60%, which is, the numbers have changed now, but historically 60% of production is 200 pigs or less. Those small farms don't give the mandatory vaccines because they're trying to make a buck, and every vaccine takes $1 away. So this is where you have continuing problems with these diseases. It's with small producers, but that's 60% of the swine production. And the MARA does not have an adequate enforcement body, so it's not enforced.
Okay.
They do have
question. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say they do have, before ASF, they had a PRRS regional control strategy. So MARA was working with Boehringer Ingelheim and FAO to create regional disease control areas targeting PRRS for eradication. And so they had an eradication program ongoing for PRRS, but they have scrapped that since ASF has impacted them, simply because they don't have the manpower.
Okay. The other question is, you mentioned the pull tooth theory that ASF moves slowly through a herd, and that surprised me, but please clarify, is that true with all strains or just a lower path strain?
No, this would be true of the high virulent African swine fever. So to give you an example, I was involved in one of these farms. We had African swine fever break out on a farm, and myself and another colleague went to the farm, and we were assigned the mission by our leadership to see if we could control the disease, and this was with the permission and understanding of MARA. So they brought in what they thought were the best experts to try and control this disease. And so we were implementing that type of a procedure, and we could control the disease within farms on that farm. This was a sow farm, so we had a gestation area, we had weaning areas, and we had boar studs that were present on the farm, and teaser bores, and that type of thing. And we were able to control the disease for about 2.5 months before basically we were losing too many sows to make the farm productive anymore. So the farm was shut down and we completely depopulated the farm. But African swine fever does move very slowly on a farm, and it's typically by direct contact or contaminated products. It's not going to be transmitted through aerosol like you might see with an FMD. FMD shows up on a farm, and it's going to be all throughout that barn in a day. ASF shows up on a farm, and you will see a hot zone that will just grow from one corner and expand. If you can control that hot zone, you can control the disease on the farm for a period, because the virus is very hardy. It survives.
Okay, we do have another question. With the rebuilding of the large farms in Asia to replace lost pork production, are they also instituting extra biosecurity or quarantine?
Yes, they are. So these farms are built with the concept of the Great Wall. I think you all know the Great Wall. These farms have an extensive wall around them. It's either, well, most of the time it's actually brick or a concrete wall that completely surrounds the farm. These walls are at least 10 feet high with barbed wire at the top. And so really there's only one way in and out of the farm, and that's the front gate. And so they can control everything that comes into the farm. And that actually, you have to remember, these farms are a community. So all the farm workers on say a sow farm, say a 6,000 head sow farm, or in this case a 30,000 head sow farm, they have an entire community with the residents, the cafeteria, recreational facilities, all of that contained within that wall. So actually nothing goes in and out of that facility except for through that gate. And typically personnel that work on a farm have usually 4 days a month where they can leave the premise. But then they have roughly now a 5-day biosecurity check. They go through different facilities before they can get entrance back into the farm. So yes, they have installed quite good biosecurity on these new facilities.
We do have another question. What mitigation strategies are in place to decrease the risk of ASF transmission from the bulk containers and mineral/feed supplements imported into the U.S.?
That question I cannot answer because I don't know. I've been in Asia for the last 5 years. I haven't reviewed exactly what they're doing, and I haven't spoken with anyone on the U.S. border side as to what they're doing with seeds, vitamins, and minerals that are being imported into the country from ASF-positive countries for use in feeds and feed ingredients. So, unfortunately, I cannot answer that question.
Okay. With that, does anyone else have any other questions to come through the chat? I just got another one. What are your thoughts about using a test and remove strategy for control of infected farms as opposed to a total depop and decon or stamping out strategy if the goal is eventual eradication?
Well, I know for African swine fever, and again, we have to keep in mind not every disease is transmitted the same way. So there's a stark contrast between foot and mouth disease and African swine fever. Absolutely, you cannot do it with foot and mouth disease. Foot and mouth disease, you got to detect it as early as you can, and you have to depopulate. Classic swine fever is kind of in the middle, but to me, it would be depopulate. African swine fever, you can control it for a period. So if you can set up the right types of regional control, so for example, if you have this, well, it depends on where the farm is. If it's in a hotbed in the Carolinas or Iowa, the ideal is depopulate, depopulate, depopulate. If it gets out of control to a point where you don't have the manpower, then potentially you can come in and use this strategy of the tooth extraction strategy or compartmentalization strategy to try and control the disease until you can best manage things moving forward. I've seen it done in China, so I know it works, but I know ultimately they're compromised by the disease. Their numbers of sows, as I saw on one farm, the number of sows gradually declined to where the farm just isn't profitable.
Okay. As of right now, we don't have any other questions in the chat. I also would like to thank you, Rich, for presenting today. And now that I'm getting more questions, so here we go.
Okay.
Let's go and check these out. We've got a couple more minutes to go. If an effective vaccine is developed prior to ASF introduction into the U.S., do you see its use as a prevention in the U.S.?
My mindset would be no, because most likely an efficacious vaccine is going to be a modified live. What they know already is that subunit vaccines and kill vaccines don't work and can actually make the disease worse. In other words, the animals progress with clinical signs and die earlier with kill vaccines or a subunit vaccine. So the likely vaccine that will be created will be a modified live, which means it's a live vaccine, and you're not going to want to use that prophylactically if you do not have the disease present in the U.S.
Okay. Can we control movements by education?
Well, I think so, because I think a lot of times there's a couple things make people move pigs or move any animal. Is one, they can get more money down the road. They're trying to save prize genetic stock, or they're just trying to make a buck. But if you can educate producers and even the lay people, small producers, on how diseases move and what the critical factors are, and most of the time it's human behavior and illegal or inappropriate movement of animals or animal byproducts or contaminated products. And that's a critical point that needs to be hit home in terms of education.
Okay, there is another question that's talking about who in the U.S. would be able to answer the question regarding what is current biosecurity on the U.S. side for all feed and mineral and other products. I can check on that and see. For some reason, I think it's probably somebody through the import staff. And then, based on your presentation, would you agree that it is a major factor in our national security against ASF?
Yes, it is. Feed and feed ingredients is a major factor.
And then another question is, what methods do they usually use for depop and disposal of large numbers of pigs infected with ASF in China?
The farms that I were involved with, it was all burial on site. So, they bring in a backloader and they dig a deep pit, line the pit, and all the carcasses go in that pit and it's buried. Which was actually one of the requirements of MARA, is that any depopulation has to be done on site. So that means if you don't have the ground to do it, you have to, basically demolish buildings and open up the ground and bury them on site. They didn't allow transport to any other burial sites. There was no burning or anything of that sort. They don't have digesters or incinerators on these farms adequate to depopulate.
Okay, so this is kind of a comment and a question. E-commerce has introduced opportunities for Chinese origin meat products entry into the U.S. These products enter frequently through both the air and sea pathways. Thousands of pounds of products are entering monthly. Please provide your thoughts on the risk of this situation.
Yes, one of the things that we do not know is some of our largest food distributing companies in the U.S. are actually China-owned. And the reason that China has made these strategic moves is so that they can move product into, well, they can open up markets for their product. So it is true that processed foods can move into the U.S., and they are moving into the U.S. As I mentioned to you, frozen pork reserves, so basically pork products in China, but also the rest of Asia, have a very high potential of being contaminated with African swine fever, simply because of the strategies that they put in place to put pork into their reserves, and the fact that their strategy right now is to not depopulate farms with ASF. They just move the animals that can get to slaughter, go to slaughter, and are processed for food. So these products, depending on how they are processed, could be contaminated with the ASF. The issue is whether that ASF is infectious. One of the nice things about African swine fever is it can actually survive in salted porks, perma-hams, smoked pork products, and things of that sort. So if those are some of the foods that are being allowed into the U.S., that would be an issue. If it's fully cooked, processed pork, such as in dumplings and things of that sort, that would be a different issue. So it depends on the product that's moving into the U.S., but it would certainly be a potential source of ASF.
Okay. What about the method of depop euthanasia?
So in China, they use electrocution. They have basically electric rods that they use to electrocute each of the pigs within a facility. It's a long process, but it's actually quite efficient. I've seen it used.
Okay. Well, we're heading near to our time, so I'm going to also conclude this webinar. And thanks again, Rich, for presenting today. And thanks to everyone who also attended the webinar. There'll be additional webinar information sent out in the next week, and we will continue on with our webinar series for our FAD. And I'd like to bid you all a great afternoon.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks, Rich.